Hey everybody, Bethel here, one of the co-hosts of a podcast for all intents and purposes, with a message from the invisible editor of the show. You might have noticed last week, and you will notice this week, that neither Andrew nor I discuss the recent incidents of mass gun violence that has occurred in the United States of America over the last couple weeks. This is not because we feel those issues aren't important. This is because even though the show presents itself as a weekly nerdy and geeky news and discussion show, what it ultimately is, and I hope this comes through, is a chance for two very old friends to get together on the phone and talk for an hour. And there are some issues, incidents, events that during that hour we don't want to talk about. I want to make it clear that everybody here, for all intents and purposes, supports, at a minimum, common sense gun reform, with the understanding that such reform will not solve the problem, but we know it couldn't hurt. Both Andrew and I feel these recent events explicitly, because both Andrew and I work at academic institutions for day jobs. I am a teacher who every day shares a room with students with an unlocked door, because that's how it's supposed to work. We hope everybody listening, in the United States or not, does their best to become as educated on these events as possible, so that you can state your opinion as loudly and as impactfully as possible, with the hope that, within the limits of our ability, some sort of change can happen. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the show. You're listening to the 14th source for all geeky and nerdy news and discussion, which means that you're listening to a podcast.
For all intents and purposes.
I'm Bethel.
And I'm Andrew Asplund.
And we are your two overeducated, codependent nerd hosts, bringing you the things that we like to talk about, but filtered through inquisitive and critical lenses. In the episode for Friday, May 27th, 2022.
This is the last Friday of May.
Oh, yes.
This is what in the business we call Memorial Day weekend.
Whew, you scared me. I thought you made an editorial decision and we're going to say this is the last episode ever of the show.
Oh shit, can I make that decision?
You almost did, apparently. But yes, the end of May, holiday weekend.
For those of us in Los Estados Unidos.
And if you have the opportunity to celebrate, please do. If you have to work, thank you for working. But I wish you didn't have to. And speaking of celebration, Andrew, before we get to what we're going to be talking about this week, I want to do a little Star Trek update! That seems like an appropriate tone for talking about Star Trek.
What?
Star Trek update! Okay. Strange New Worlds. What are you thinking? We had some pretty good episodes, I would say, in episodes 2 and 3. I think I sent you this in text, but episode 3, I think it's called The Ghosts of Illyria. That it's just a Doctor Who episode. Like, The line is gone between them. Like, they're not even pretending anymore. It's swap Pike out for the Doctor, and you're good to go.
No, it continues for me to be a fun show to watch. I enjoy it. I like it. And it's very different than what the previous Star Treks in the last 3 years have done, which I think I really like that. Rather than, one series trying to do all the episodes, like, I get why that has purpose, but it's like, let's just accept, like, 10 episodes of this, new Planet a Week show, and then the other shows can handle the dramatized storylines and the serialized narratives. Which is funny, I guess, coming from my point of view, where I'm not up on the new Star Treks, except for Strange New Worlds. I'm coming from TNG. I'm like, this is... Yeah, they're doing the Star Trek. This is great. It's just different people at different sets and better, not better budgets, but definitely better special effects. For me, I think the big thing is the realization that they've just really been I think all the new shows have just, their casting has been pretty great. Yeah. When they have like someone that's not like, that doesn't maybe work out, that they find something new, or as I like to say with Discovery Season 1, that person was intended not to work out, right?
Right.
So I do think they like, I think in a way that TNG did, where like a lot of these actors, even if they didn't have the best scripts, if the stories weren't the best, they still really like sold you on their character, on what they're doing. Yeah, and I think this new show is doing that in spades.
Yeah. So that's your quick Star Trek check-in, or what do they call it? Star Trek update! But we've got other stuff we need to get to. Well, what we're going to be doing this week, dear listeners, is kind of relaxing, chatting, talking about what has been not pushing our buttons, getting us excited. That sounds weird too. What has been attracting our attention for this last week or two or more with our respective weeks in geek. Mm-hmm. So, Andrew, what specifically nerdy, science fiction, fantasy, comic book, nerdy, geeky thing have you done this week?
Oh, excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
Basketball.
What?
So,
I didn't. Can you name another sport?
Basketball.
There we go.
So I was sitting on Twitter one day.
Oh no!
And I saw someone I know who is a big nerdy guy that does a lot of nerdy shit.
Right.
Tweeting about the HBO series Winning Time.
Oh yeah, okay.
And he tweeted after the 10th episode came out. He said, "Oh man, when does season 2 come out? I may have to start watching basketball."
Right.
And I was like, "What?" Actually, I had a conversation with my parents because my parents were, I was born in Los Angeles. I was, in the 80s, we were a family that watched the Lakers. And I was never a big basketball person, but I remember the impact, right, of that. And so I talked to my parents and said, "Oh, maybe you should watch this." And they're like, "Ooh, what? TV?"
For those that don't know, the Lakers in the 80s were like the hot shit.
Oh, spoiler, right? That's what the show's about, okay?
Oh, okay, there you go.
So, but for me, it's like, actually, I remember enough of how big they were that, and the fact that some nerdy guy who doesn't give a shit about basketball is talking about it. I was like, well, let me take a look. And I knew it starred John C. Reilly.
Oh, yeah, okay.
In kind of the main part as the new owner of the Lakers in 1979, Dr. Jerry Buss. So I was like, well, John C. Reilly, when I see him in things that aren't like his dumb comedy, I love him. I think he's great. I actually think he's a really, he can do these silly, comedy films, but then he'll turn around and do something else. And you're like, oh, wow, right. You are in fact an actor.
Right. There's a glimmer. You're like, oh, I think this guy's actually a capital A, super good actor. But he just seems to revel in that goofy, surreal, absurdist stuff too, which I love. I think it's great as well. But so is this a docu-drama? Is it fictionalizing real events and people?
Yes, but let me go ahead and preface right now. Basically, almost everyone that's featured in this show has said this show is bad.
Of course, yeah. That tends to be how it goes. Which means it's probably good, actually.
I believe Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the Buss family, Paul Westhead, Pat Riley, they've all said no, this is not a good show. And honestly, they even have a preface, I think, at the end of every episode that says, hey, there's a dramatization. They've they've merged some characters for narrative purposes.
Sure.
And I accept that. I kind of accept the fact that they do that. And this is a show. It's a drama. It's a drama loosely inspired by real events. Although what I'll say is that the big pushes of the story are real. It's the characters and how they interact and who they are that are made for TV.
Right.
But yeah, I started watching this show and I was into it, right? I think I watched the whole series over the course of a week. Right.
Nice.
Because it was just wow, this is it's dramatic, it's whatever, and it has these characters that I know who that is, right?
Yeah.
I know who Magic Johnson is, I know who Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is, I've heard of these people.
That's interesting, yeah.
Actually, I think the big thing was I know who Paul Westhead is because I went to Paul Westhead basketball camp in 1989.
Oh yeah, because you were tall even back then.
Right. Well, the joke was I didn't know who he was as a kid, and I'm like, oh, he was at that point, kind of loser former coach of the Lakers. I say loser. He actually, at that point, had taken Loyola Marymount University to many successful endeavors. But just the idea that, oh, who is this guy? He's a former Lakers coach, right?
Huh. Yeah.
The thing about the show is, it's a drama. It is silly at times. It's filmed. There's some very distinctive style choices, right?
Okay.
There are certain things where they film it. First of all, there's a lot of fourth wall breaking.
Really? Okay.
Where not just one character, but several characters will occasionally turn to the camera and address the audience. Mostly Jerry Buss, the owner, but other people do it too. And some scenes are filmed as if like they're trying to make it look like it's on the film stock of the day, right? Like here's
that's
this,
cool.
you know, it's kind of gritty looking or whatever. There's actually a lot of scenes where there's, you know, like on the sides of the 16:9 screen, there's like shit that I assume is like something from film in that time. Right, like you're seeing something that's bigger than what was intended to be seen on film. Like you're seeing like little, like there's, you know, little black stuff and whatever,
like cigarette burns.
Not the cigarette burns, but like that, right?
Like that, yeah.
So, but they do that is like a style choice. But I think for me, and I should say that the series is based off of a book, which I believe is called Showtime. From the, I think, early to mid 90s.
And HBO can't have a show called Showtime.
Right, so the whole thing is that they optioned the book, and the big reveal was like, well, let's make this. Oh, yeah, it's great. We cannot call it Showtime. Because that's a reference to, that's the era, the Showtime era of Lakers basketball. So it is this weird, fictionalized story, you know, rooted in real events, but definitely fictionalized. And I just like they do so many things that feel like it felt almost at times. I wrote all these texts to Dan and Taylor and then deleted half of them because I didn't want to reveal how nerdy I was into this. Where like it felt like it was an MCU movie.
Okay, explain.
Where they would have scenes where they like reference something, and you know, if you know, like if you've read the comics, if you know the history of the Lakers, you know what they're referring to. And it's like, the one, I think it's the third or fourth episode, they had this whole discussion about how they want to get not cheerleaders, but like something more like, you know, something sexier, you know.
Right.
There's a scene where they have a dance troupe who is there, and the owner's like, this is not sexy enough. I want something more like, you know, with your hips, whatever. And there's the one young lady who's dancing. He's like, yeah, like her, like the tan girl. And then they go follow her to where she's from, Van Nuys High School, where she's basically a cheerleading coach. Mm-hmm. And they hire her and say, hey, you'll be the choreographer for our Laker girls. Okay. And then the show like almost does the pause and they drop her name on the screen, Paula Abdul.
Oh, crazy.
Which, if you know, she got her start as a Laker girl, became the choreographer. Right. And then it was basically picked up by, I think the Jacksons, but just the idea they realized like, wow, she's good, you know. Right. But it's that kind of thing. It's that comic book thing of like, oh man, you could, you know, like it's you're spinning off the Paula Abdul story right now, right? Even though she doesn't even show up, I think, for the rest of the movie, because you know, other than the few scenes where you see the Laker girls dancing, right? The show. Others, you know, there's a scene where Pat Riley, who at the time was kind of a down on his luck former basketball player, who starts becoming an announcer for the Lakers. But there's a scene where he's really struggling, and you know he's from West Virginia. His father they suggest he has a negative relationship with his father. And the scene where he like he's got a mustache and, you know, long 70s hair, and he gets frustrated and pulls his hair back in a style like his father. And you're like, oh, they're referencing the look he adopts in the mid 80s. Right, it's that kind of thing where it's like from the first Iron Man when Rhodey looks and says, "Oh, not now, right? Next time, baby." Right, looks at the War Machine outfit and says, "Next time." It's like they're doing that kind of shit all over this series, except that not comic books, but the Lakers.
Right. But still, like, watchable without that knowledge as well. Like it's like you said, it's those weird sort of inside kind of. Not jokes, but you know what I mean.
But right, like you don't need to know that, but they definitely they want, if you know the narrative, you know what's, you know, like, oh, where they're going with that. Again, it feels very much like these comic book stories where it's like, oh, I know this is where Hulk dies, you know. Oh, let's tease it. Oh, yeah, now he dies or whatever. Right?
Is it set up to be an ongoing series? Because it kind of sounds like that's something that would. HBO is not averse to doing limited series and stuff like that.
It's been renewed for season 2.
Okay. All right. There you go.
Which I think they actually lean into because, you know, one of the big things, also a big narrative, is that, you know, when Magic Johnson was drafted to the Lakers, his like big nemesis at the time as a college player was a fella from rural Illinois that was drafted by the Celtics, known as Larry Byrd.
Yeah.
And although they have like one episode where that interaction like kind of happens, that doesn't come up until like years later, right? Like the 83 season, I think. Right, so it's like, but they spend time, in fact, they even have basically the character of Magic hallucinating this like rural Larry Byrd who's like, yeah, better than you.
That's...
you know, so like it is like they're setting up this overly dramatic comic book telling of a basketball team.
Right. That's crazy. And that it works is good. I was really surprised to hear that it's actually like a straight ahead drama, because the promotional image that I see on the HBO Max app doesn't look silly, but it looks like this was fun times. I mean, I'm not saying it's all dark or anything, but like
it is a bit silly at times.
But
right?
Also there's been a trend of sort of pseudo-historical series lately that have been mostly leaning into the comedy aspect of it. I think most recently, Our Flag Means Death, which
yes,
coincidentally, I listened to a historical podcast about Blackbeard that was unrelated to that show at all. And big surprise, they cover Stede Bonnet pretty extensively because he was a big part of Blackbeard's life. And just listening to him, like, that happened in that happened in the show. Okay, wow. They like did their research on this show. The only thing they're really fictionalizing not the only thing they're fictionalizing, but the narratively is the extent of the relationship between Blackbeard and Stede, right? And not even fictionalizing, we just don't know.
But you could also imagine that if they were alive, they would have complained about how this show's bullshit. It's not accurate.
And similarly, also on Hulu, I think it is. Yeah, The Great, which is telling the story of Catherine the Great's rise to power in Russia. Where the tagline of the show is the sometimes true story, and it's heavily fictionalized and heavily modernized, and not that it takes place in modern times, but in terms of language, in terms of casting and stuff like that, they don't care about historicism in that case.
I want to acknowledge that because Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, when he actually wrote a piece about how bad the show is, and he actually referenced The Great, saying like, "Oh, this is fine."
When he said that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was upset about the show, I'm like, that's the one guy you don't want to upset, because that dude can write, and he can skewer anybody if he wants to.
Right. And I want to address that because there are a lot of presentations of people that are like maybe not in their best. I mean, I would say like Magic Johnson is portrayed in a way that if you know the history, you're like, well, this is not surprising, right? Like he has sex with lots of people. Like he engages in behaviors that don't match the persona that maybe we thought in the 80s. Right. That's always the thing I always talk about when he announced that he had HIV. Even my mother was like, oh, but he's Magic. But the realization, like, well, yeah, but he's also a celebrity in Los Angeles making a shit ton of money and doing what he wants to do.
In his 20s or whatever, right? Like,
yeah, right. I mean, a very fit 20-something, like, doing his life. But so, like, I get why there's that frustration. But I would say that for me personally, and I'm probably unique, I do feel that it is actually very much increased my interest in these people, because like, while I can accept that like the presentation of them wasn't accurate, like I'll say like Kareem, he's played by actually the fellow that plays Kareem is a college ball player. I think he may have played pro, but he's also like an academic from Stanford now. Where he got like his PhD and whatever. He's like, what? The actor, right?
That's awesome.
Although I actually think Kareem is also, very educated. But
Kareem is,
Yeah, so the actor, like, he was working in academia, and he's like, well, I'm going to try acting. And, of course, they needed someone to play a tall black basketball player. He's like, academic, I'm pretty good at that. And he's great, actually. He's great, and I want to say this is a super weird connection. One of my coworkers played ball with him.
Yeah.
And also said, he's great. Like, he is actually, if any like Hollywood people listen to this, like put him in your stuff. Like I think he actually, I would say that's the character watching it. I know there's scenes that Kareem doesn't like, but there's a lot of stuff where I see him doing. I'm like, wow, I'm much more interested in this person than I think I was before.
Right.
Because there's a whole episode devoted to his history and why he became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Also, weird thing for me, did not realize that was not his birth name.
No, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was. No, it's not. I was actually kind of stupidly surprised as a grown-ass man in the 2020s. But like they have an episode where they address that in his relationship with police violence, violence against black people, black Americans. And I was like, wow, even if this isn't accurate, I still think this person is much more interesting. And actually, even Magic Johnson, even Jerry Buss, John C. Reilly plays him as kind of like this like playboy. I mean, he literally is friends with Hugh Hefner. Although I gotta say, he's his character. He has his PhD. That's why he's Dr. Jerry Buss. I think he was an academic at USC who got into real estate and got hooked up with kind of the playboy culture of LA, and then just buys the team. And he's great though. Like even though they portray him sometimes as like a skeezy. In fact, he probably gets portrayed the most negatively, where he like. Is into young ladies in awkward, right? Like kind of like there's several scenes where it's very awkward, but at the same time it was enough for me to be like, oh, this is interesting. I would be interested to know more about a guy who got his PhD in like physical chemistry, worked for like the DOD, and then is like, fuck it, I'm gonna go buy a basketball team. So yeah, I think the character portrayals and the way they portray the way that they present them makes to me was the kind of thing where I wanted to know more about them. Not in I presume that there's dramatization. So I liked it. I thought that was great.
Cool.
I'm literally watching other basketball series, like documentaries, just because I'm like, oh, let me know more. Right?
Then you actually start watching basketball and you're just like, it's just people running back and forth. Where's the drama?
That's right. Yeah, because this show only cuts to the dramatic ones, right? Like, yeah, take every basketball game, cut it down to 5 minutes. I'm on board. So here I am, just gushing about a basketball show,
and finally bringing a family together. You now have something to talk about with your parents.
Well, the joke is they probably won't watch it. They'll be like, oh, it's too whatever,
Your dad's like, have you seen the new Star Trek, though? It's just nuts.
What I will say is it is interesting also from a historical perspective because of how, they kind of sell in the show that basketball wasn't doing well in the late 70s. And how probably the rise of the Lakers and what they did is what turned basketball into the thing that suddenly like everyone's into, right?
There's for a lot of sports, especially there's those inception points, like for hockey for a while, just the thing that like it breaks through to the popular culture and gets eyes on it, if not forever, but for a while. Like the Miracle on Ice, the was 1980 American hockey team against Russia in the Olympics. All of a sudden, people cared about hockey for a minute. Same thing, similarly, like the Lakers kind of bringing attention back to basketball, which is great.
Right. Well, at this point, for like a decade, right? And then it kind of like
Then they sold out.
Well, there's actually a lot that goes on there. I'm waiting for season 10. The fact that like non-basketball kids are watching this, being like, oh, all right.
I can see basketball fans being kind of conflicted because they probably like the show, but then they're hearing legends saying that the show is bad, and it brings to mind something that we talked about a lot in my major, which is historical truth versus sort of like emotional truth. If you want historical truth, watch a documentary.
Right.
Movies are stories, and they are here to they have a limited space, a limited amount of time, and they need to tell a complete story that can't by its very nature include all the details of everything that happened. And so characters are amalgamated, things are left out, things are changed. But if at its core, like the essential like theme that the writers are trying to get across, what the writers see kind of emerging from the historical series of events, if that's still coming through, and if that's truthful in a sense, then it's a good story, even if it's not factually completely 100% true, right? But even documentaries aren't authentic because those are still movies or still TV shows, right? And they still have to conform to those expectations.
And I do want to actually go back to the coworker who I interact with about this, because actually the whole thing I found out he knew the guy that played Kareem. I asked him like, have you seen this? He's like, oh no, I don't want to watch that, because for him, as a person that that grew up in this era as well, but also for him, like that became a life thing. Like he played basketball professionally. He said, I don't want to see like them ruin it, right? So I do get that. Like, if the idea that this is not maybe the most flattering portrayal of these characters, I can appreciate why some people may not want to see it, because it's the docu-series where you find out your favorite whatever president is actually a pederast. Like, well, maybe I don't want to see that. or portrayed in a way that's not truthful, but makes it not, unpleasant. So I get that. I enjoyed it as someone who didn't really, the only perspective I had was as a kid in the 80s being in a Lakers family. I thought it was great. And now I'm not going to go start watching the Lakers, but I definitely am much more interested in the history behind it. So,
right. Cool.
Yeah. So that was my Week in Geek. I know, surprising, not actually the normal geek you expect. Although before we transition to Dan's Week in Geek, I do want to say the one thing I've taken away from my experience is that, guess what? You could be a geek about anything, right?
Yeah.
The level of like geekiness about basketball is really no different than the level of geekiness about comic books.
Right. What's the difference between cosplay at a comic convention and like the people who like go to games and like paint their faces with team colors and make banners and flags and stuff like that? No, there's no difference.
And wear the jerseys and shit. Yeah.
It's that can name the starting lineup from San Francisco Giants back in 1977 or something like that, right?
Yeah.
It's no different.
So it is. So it was kind of a fun moment of being in another nerdy world.
Right.
And realizing like, okay, I get this. Yeah. But anyway, that was my Week in Geek, Dan. What about you?
Well, I'm going to talk about the National Hockey League. No, I'm not.
It's like suddenly our first entirely sports-filled episode.
Don't say that. That'll never happen. I didn't watch sports. I played a video game in between bouts of grading. I ended up spending a lot of time with this indie game that I'd heard about for over the last couple of years, but it was on sale, so I'm like, check it out. It's a game called Narita Boy, made by a company called Studio Koba out of Spain. Basically, it's a side-scrolling action game with pixel art, kind of like a retro-styled game. So retro in that this threw me for a loop. I was going into like the settings and stuff like that. And there, in the graphics and video settings, there's like CRT filter effect or something like that. And I'm like, no, I don't want that on. So I didn't click it. And then I went and started the game. And the game by default, apparently that's the thing to turn it off, because the game by default is like, it's warped to look like an old CRT, curved television screen with blur on the edges. And I'm like, wait, so what happens when I go turn this on or whatever? And it just makes it fit the screen fully, but it still has a slight blurring at the edges. But it's really leaning into the retro thing. And you play a character called Narita Boy, who is a chosen one, who uses the tetrachrome sword to slice through evil stallions, as they're called, to rescue the motherboard of this computer world, because it's basically a Tron styled story where you are a boy sucked into a computer, and only you can save what's called the creator, who's the programmer of this world you're in. It's interesting because I'd seen it on like reviews and stuff, and I always liked the look. It's got a really nice, really well animated pixel art kind of look. But it's interesting because when I think of side-scrolling action platformers, I think of Castlevanias, I think of Mega Man, I think of Mario, right? Mm-hmm. But the visuals to me look a lot more like, and are animated a lot more like the old PC adventure games, like by like Sierra and LucasArts, right? I'm thinking of Police Quest is the first one that comes to mind. Why? But I think
get off the show,
right? Secret of Monkey Island. But those kinds of styles, like almost like really tall character designs, really kind of just really like subtle and kind of wobbly movements, not sort of the very tightly animated sort of idle poses and running animations that you find in 8-bit console games. I mean, because of that, I think I might, when I see that art style, I think, it's going to be kind of sluggish, a little slow, but they've done a really good job merging that art style with very, I'm not going to say tight gameplay, but very competent and successful and usable gameplay, even though because of the high level of animation, it's a bit slower than maybe what you want at times. But I actually have, once you figure out kind of the groove, the rhythm of the game, it's very playable and very, very fun. The basic loop of it is that as you play and go through the story, you unlock more abilities, power-ups as they call them.
Oh, okay.
With your sword, you can, you have you press the square button, or what is it, the X button to slash, and you eventually get like, if you press left and slash, you can do like a charging move, or you can do a down slash move, or an uppercut kind of move, kind of unlocking abilities as you go on. But the thing is, I can say all this, and initially it is just kind of presented as like kind of Tron-style throwback nostalgia bent with fun gameplay. But as you play, this game goes deep. You realize, like, this is an indie game that's being as indie as it possibly can, using gaming as a metaphor for personal trauma. The opening cutscene kind of explains what the game is about. You see this balding programmer at his computer, and he's just programming and whatnot. And on his screen goes wonky, and this weird, evil-looking red demon thing shows up on his screen and reaches out, and literally reaches through the screen and bonks the programmer on the head, and he goes unconscious. And when he wakes up, you see question marks above his head because there's no dialogue. There's no spoken dialogue. There's text dialogue. But what we learn is that this person, the creator, has lost his memories, which threatens the existence of this digital world that he has created. And as Narita Boy, because once the system recognized that the creator's memories have been stolen or lost, the Narita Boy protocol was enacted, and a kid just somewhere else who's playing on his computer. The computer system in this game world is called the Narita One. Mm-hmm. He gets sucked into the machine and becomes Narita Boy, and is the chosen one to help save this world, which means finding the memories of the creator. And as you find the memories of the creator, holy shit, things are bad, right? And by memories, I mean childhood loss, teenage suffering, cults. It's insane in a very interesting and entertaining way. It never goes for full, you're meant to cry here, like that. It's not self-serious in the least. It's telling all the story, even like the serious parts, not with his tongue in his cheek, but very sort of self-aware, and doesn't plumb the depths of sorrow or sadness too deeply. But it goes enough to kind of give a gravity to the scene before going back to the goofiness of being a digital knight. But it's really interesting to dive back and forth and literally see the intersection between art and not art and expression, but sort of fiction and biography, and how that becomes expression. And you start seeing like, these things you're encountering in the game as you swing your sword, your digital sword around to fight bad. It's kind of like Wizard of Oz. You're like, that villain I've been fighting looks a lot like this person we're now seeing in this memory. I get it now. But it's all artfully done and cleverly done, and it is tough. It's a tough game, but it's kind of got that sort of what they call Nintendo hard, right? Where like if you just kind of learn the patterns and keep throwing yourself at it, you get through it, and you keep going forward. And with that in mind, like it's really scratching that sort of Nintendo like retro itch where they really have that style of gameplay locked down, where it gives you all the tools you need. It's just a matter of, are you using them effectively? It never feels cheap, and it never feels punishing, but it does feel difficult. And they don't go with the retro route and saying you've only got 4 lives. If you die, just starts you back at whatever most recent, and it's got a good checkpointing system in the game. It just starts you back, and you kind of go back into it. You don't lose any currency or progression. It's just like, no, try again with full health. But it's really clever the way they use the digital computer world, and how they are creating a fantasy world, because it's a recognizably fantasy world, in that your character is a knight but doesn't have armor and a helmet or anything like that. It looks weird, but he has a sword, and you're slashing and jumping and chopping at enemies, but he's got a screen for a face and a floppy disk drive in his chest. It's a fantasy world that's thoughtful and developed, but not traditional. Even though it's not a unique or original setting, it's nice seeing the level of care and attention and thought that they put into this unique fantasy setting, which makes it engaging. They're not just playing with, especially with the popularity of Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and stuff like that. It's nice to see a very unique and different fantasy. It's playing with a completely different aesthetic, but still doing all the things a good fantasy does.
You had me at Tron.
Right?
No, that is. Although I was a little off put where you're like, wow, it looks like it's on a TV. I'm like, woof.
But you can turn, ostensibly, you can turn that off.
This is actually one of those interesting things where more and more I'm just like, these small games, maybe they're not the biggest or the best, but they all just like, they're finding a place where they're doing something that like, oh, this is fun. And honestly, I find that I'm not engaging with as many, big budget stuff because I'm like, oh, this is more compelling, more interesting, more fun.
I think what we're seeing now, especially in the indie space. Well, let me say this first. This game, I guess, started as a Kickstarter. I hadn't known that. It kickstarted in 2017, and it met and exceeded its goal, not by a lot, but I think its goal was 120,000 euros. Sorry, and it earned 160K.
120 euros. Like,
the exchange rate's insane. It was set to release they planned to release it in 2018. It got pushed, and then COVID happened, and then actually released in March 2021. So it's been a little over a year. So it came out, and it, I guess, delivered on all of its promises. But it's a small team, I guess a team of 6, but it's really the brainchild of the director, whose name is, let me check my notes. I heard it said as Eduardo Fornieles, and like I said, it's a studio out of Spain. And it's just his brainchild. He's a pixel artist. He's a designer. He's a musician. Although he didn't do all those things, but I'm guessing he created a prototype that had basically everything he needed. But he was able to get a team together that he was able to hire people to make what he was seeing and putting together in rudimentary fashion into full-fledged functional fashion. I should say the music in this game is outstanding. Going back to what I was saying, like this is a person that obviously grew up like we did, playing those 8-bit games. And the interesting thing is with Kickstarter, or at least the indie scene, we're seeing a lot of interaction between people inspired by those games and people who made those games. With Iga and Bloodstained, right? With the guy whose name I can't remember, who made that very bad game, Mighty Number 9.
Oh, right.
Like the Mega Man's dad made, I think that was a Kickstarter game too as well, wasn't it?
It was. Although it's more like Mega Man's like weird uncle.
Yeah, basically, yeah. But the thing is, with Mighty Number 9, with Bloodstained's a bigger success story. The thing I'll say about Bloodstained is that it was good. I like it, but it wasn't really pushing what that thing was to the next kind of level. I'm not saying like it needed to innovate, but there was nothing really kind of new. It did what it did really well and it was super fun. It was the creator of this genre, the Metroidvania, doing another one of those, which is great, and it was good. Can't say the same for Mighty Number 9 and it doing another Mega Man, but that's beside the point. I think what I'm seeing here is like, and I'm generalizing here, and we can all point to instances where I'm completely wrong, but I think in the indie space specifically, we're seeing people that love these games that they grew up with, but are also modern gamers, and they're able to, maybe perhaps more effectively, able to take the foundation of the games that they love and actually insert it into a modern kind of gaming scene, and actually even though it looks retro, it plays retro, it's actually doing new interesting things, whether it's narrative, whether it's mechanical, whether it's systems based, right? And I'm not saying Narita Boy is breaking new ground, but it's definitely doing things that games in this genre, this platform side-scrolling hack and slasher, don't normally do. Leaning hard into those retro aesthetics and styles, but telling a story that is very modern and like let's address trauma. Let's address loss, but also not having it be discordant or breaking, ludonarrative dissonance. It's seamlessly woven together with the gameplay, with the style that you're playing. So you never all of a sudden. One thing I'll say is that when you go to find the memories, you go into the creator's memory, and you're walking around as this weird, computer boy. You can't do any attacking or anything like that. So the gameplay changes a little bit, where all you can do is basically move around and interact. But it's not any different than you see in games where like, okay, in this scene, you we don't want you attacking people because that would be fucked up. That would break the game, right? Right. So it hamstrings you, but not like in a way that's like, whoa, everything, you lied to me about everything. It's just it's very focused, and
other games have done this, yeah.
Right. I've gotten through the game pretty quickly just because I found it so engaging and fun and interesting, and the way you move throughout the world and how beautiful the pixel art is. It's really really well done and really interesting and really creative. And I can't really, even though I can see how people could bounce off it, I can't recommend it highly enough because it's really cool, really doing cool things.
Just another game to add to my Steam deck.
And I can't wait to hear your opinions about it, Andrew, when you finally play it in 2025. So if you have any thoughts about the topics this week, feel free to leave your thoughts as comments on the page of this episode at forallintents.net.
You also post your comments or engage in conversations with other listeners on our Facebook page.
You can also find us on other social media at our respective handles. On Twitter, you can find Andrew at Profound Dark tweeting about tabletop role-playing games, among other interesting things. And you can find me at Bethel. You can also find us on Instagram, where you can find Andrew at Profound Brick and me and my work at Bethel Comics.
While you're at our website at forallintents.net, you can take a look at our YouTube page. You may actually already be there listening to our show as it's rebroadcast on YouTube. If you're there, like and subscribe.
We use two tracks of music for our show. One is called Disco Medusae, the other is called District 4. And they are both written and performed by Kevin McLeod, the Clan McLeod, immortal swordsman, graph paper enthusiast, and musician extraordinaire.
You can find his music at incompetech.filmmusic.io, and that's all licensed under the Creative Commons 4.0 attribution license.
If you like the show and like to help us out, the best way to do so would be to subscribe to the show using whichever podcasting service you happen to use. What would help us out even more, though, would be to go to their storefront and leaving some sort of review, whether a text review or using the proprietary metric will help spread the word to new potential listeners through the magic of algorithms. Doctor Who
Is a show.
is a show.
I don't think we have much more to say about that right now.
They're
right?
bringing back David Tennant and Catherine Tate. I don't think we talked about that officially on the show. We've talked about it briefly. It's just one of those things, like, we'll see it when it happens. But next year seems like it's going to be a very interesting year for Doctor Who. 60th anniversary. Diamond anniversary.
For those of you into that.
Which means what they should do is have the villains be Cybermen who can now be destroyed by shooting diamonds at them.
No.
No?
Unsubscribe.
Okay. Well... Call me RTD.
See.
I got the best
see.
ideas. We'll see. Yeah. So until you have a better idea, dear listeners, I'm Bethel.
And I'm Andrew Asplund.
And for all intents and purposes,
That was a podcast. Either this is the most awkward, bad choice, or somebody there knew exactly what they were doing.
right? I think PR needs to talk to HR.
A Playboy.
I'm not friends with Hugh Hefner. He's not my friend. I disavow. I disavow.
Well, he's dead.
I think the one that the two was Paula Abdul was one. Where it's just like straight up, you're just saying like, oh
Straight
look.
up, don't tell me that you really want to love me forever. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Oh, how's it go? That's a Paula Abdul song.